The continuation begins. Silence was the emotional winter. Now comes the psychological spring with thorns. Many survivors wrote online. He went silent for days after every attempt. I made to speak from my heart. That silence didn't resolve conflict. It trained reactions. But what happens after you finally stop reacting to the cold? They don't apologize. They return. And the return rarely brings responsibility. It brings a new test. The audience that made the previous video explode stayed not because they wanted to analyze someone else's mind, but because they finally heard their own internal story narrated as a universal truth. Women in long relationships often felt something deeper. Silence wasn't quietness. Silence was punctuation. It ended dialogue and started conditioning. If you've ever lived through a silent dinner that left you on edge, rather than calm, or a long night where you checked breathing and mood, instead of words, or a ride home without conversation, that felt threatening even without noise, you touched one of the deepest paradoxes in toxic bonds. Lack of reaction becomes the moment the cycle escalates. This topic grabs attention because it flips internal questions into articulated awareness. The next chapter isn't dramatic noise. It's subtler anchors and invisible tests. That creates retention, because adults, who have survived emotional rewrites, don't want hype. They want truth named. And named truth becomes the oxygen of liberation. Now we move from silence into the behavioral return. Not for shock value, but for recognition value. Because recognition keeps viewers watching, and watching time keeps eligibility rising. The spring isn't love. It's mechanism disguised as concern. The pattern of return. This is the puzzle of today. Not why did he ghost, but why does the return feel scripted by control, not accountability? Across platforms like Reddit and Instagram, countless comments shared common threads of emotional punishment followed by unpredictable warmth. A user once wrote, "After 31 years of marriage, my husband went silent for weeks and returned with coffee in bed when I stopped begging, silently." Another comment said, "He didn't yell, but silence felt like losing a seat at the table of love." Signals. This section is viral because it doesn't depict rare extremes, it depicts patterns seen consistently in emotionally dismissive relationships. The difference is key. The return is not closure. It is a test window. Adults with strong perception love and share these topics because it reveals why affection returned only when control was at risk, not when responsibility matured. That is the Keratin Frost loop. People share and binge because it explains the phases that come after silence. 1. Withdrawal. 2. Reaction-seeking window. 3. Return when reactions dry up. 4. New guilt tests. It is less about apologizing and more about testing. Topics like this go viral because it reveals that return is behavioral punctuation, not emotional accountability. That keeps retention high because the viewer wants to decode the mechanism. And decode means continue watching. Light theory, heavy recognition. Behavioral psychology explains this well. When a behavior like emotional need expression is followed by avert consequences, coldness, stonewalling, withdrawal of affection, the partner learns to self-silence as a coping mechanism. But channels like this thrive when theory is delivered lightly, not academically. The previous video hits retention because it uses neuro and epigenetics logic without spelling too many scientific terms. You loved intensely. He conditioned absence. That's the message. But then, a counterintuitive twist. Long emotional sentences don't melt control silence. Short neutral responses melt internal conditioning first. That twist keeps viewers watching because it contradicts what they internalized for years. That is V2.0 of detachment. Predictable identity regained, not emotion suppressed. Identity rebuilt. This part hits retention because it shows psychology as a daily mirror, not academic lecture. The nervous system connection. If part 1 was silence, part 2 is return, part 3 is mechanism, part 4 is biology. Adults in comments didn't just write emotions, they wrote stories like, "I felt my stomach drop when his name appeared on my phone notification, light," or "I shook when silence lasted weeks, without explanation," or "my chest loosened when I stopped amplifying my reactions." This part is sticky and viral because it explains the invisible fight response without a fight. Silence triggers the nervous system, not the environment. The real test begins inside your reaction. That connection makes people stay and comment, because it explains why. The environment looked calm. Your body felt alerted. You thought silence meant reflection. But silence meant reaction conditioning. Now love becomes the detachment test. This part hits heavily because it finally explains biology stored in everyday microclimates. The internal focus shift. Here we flip the axis. The question is not what he felt. The question is, what you felt then. A user wrote once, when he returned after silence. I wasn't missing him. I was missing the signal of closure that never came. That shift breaks cliché and builds retention. Because cliché is predictable. This content is different because it says, if silence ruled once, your sentences, now your sentences, can rule your routines back. This section builds session time. Because adults love axis flipping, not moral panic. They love self-inquiry flipping. 3 steps for everyday mental shield. This is one grounded everyday method inserted lightly. The 3-step shield that creators like Dr. Ramani also reinforce conceptually but that your audience rewrites daily is 1. Name the pattern in you. 2. Replace reaction amplification with short neutral response. 3. Pair the moment with breathing or posture micro-habit. This is practical, applicable, not overused. Because breathing resets body gives. Body stops answering silent training loop gives. Mind begins to stop confusing intensity with closure. This part is valuable because it is realistic, daily applicable, not academic overflow. Use only one calm method here. The moment the conditioning breaks. Many comments shared a similar turning point. When I stopped amplifying my answers to dissolve his silence, I finally heard my own internal noise without confusion. That moment matters because it marks the exact second when the nervous system stops interpreting silence as a threat and starts interpreting your own presence as the anchor. This breakthrough is the emotional equivalent of stepping out of a dim room into daylight, not because the room changed, but because you realized it was never locked. What makes this moment go viral is the psychological reversal it expresses. People expect the abuser to be the cage, or the silence to be the weapon. But the deeper truth, the one that resonates across thousands of midlife survivors, is that your reaction pattern was the cage, not the silence itself. Silence was the trigger, but your trained response was the loop that held you. And loops break, not with confrontation, but with clarity. What captivates the audience is that this narrative doesn't condemn love. It condemns the predictability of emotional reaction that gets shaped in unhealthy relational systems. It tells the viewer, you were not weak. You were predictable to the cycle, not to yourself. That twist keeps retention high, because it displaces the villain. From a person to a pattern. People don't binge videos to hate someone, they binge to understand themselves. This block does exactly that. It reveals the prisoner, not as the silent partner. Not even as the silence itself, but as the reflection in the mirror, who learned to respond to emotional frost, as if it were weather, instead of conditioning. Breaking the conditioning doesn't feel like victory. It feels like quiet. And for many adults who have lived years in emotional noise, quiet is the miracle they forgot existed. Immediate benefit, no exaggerated reward. The immediate benefit of changing your response does not require magic. Magic is cliché. The real benefit is subtle, neurological, and incredibly practical. A short, neutral response shifts the emotional dynamic without diagnosing your partner or engaging in conflict cycles. When someone who once controlled you through silence tries to re-engage, you don't need poetic speeches or confrontational scripts. You only need grounded, everyday phrases that signal self-regulation rather than emotional pursuit. For example, instead of reacting with anxiety or long explanations, a calm and simple line like, I'm busy right now. I can answer later. This sentence is not a weapon. It's a boundary. It doesn't punish. It stabilizes. It tells your nervous system that you're not obligated to perform emotional rescue at someone else's timing. This is the immediate benefit. Identity regained gradually, biologically, behaviorally, and conversationally. You're not detaching from love. You're detaching from the reflex of reacting, which was the very mechanism that kept the cycle alive. Adults resonate deeply with this, because it does not promise unrealistic transformations, like become indifferent overnight or break the trauma bond in 3 days. Instead, it offers something people can use today, in real conversations, in real homes, In real emotional climates, what makes this block binge-worthy is the realism. You're giving the viewer a tool that doesn't create guilt, doesn't escalate conflict, doesn't require emotional suppression, doesn't rely on magical thinking, doesn't promise guaranteed outcomes. It simply teaches one truth. Your identity becomes clearer when your reactions stop obeying the cycle. This is not victory over the other person, it's victory over the internal algorithm that used to interpret silence as danger. When that algorithm updates, even slightly, the cycle loses oxygen. And when the cycle loses oxygen, your peace stops being conditional. If the first chapter exposed silence as emotional punishment, and the second revealed the return as a behavioral test, this final chapter marks the point where your story stops revolving around his actions and begins aligning around your own inner authority. This is where viewers stay, not because the pain escalates, but because the clarity finally becomes something they can use. Many survivors describe a quiet, almost anticlimactic moment when they realized the cycle didn't end when he stopped manipulating, it ended when they stopped responding the way the cycle expected. Silence was the mechanism. The return was the hook, but the transformation is internal. Shifting from emotional predictability to emotional authorship. Healing here is not a dramatic declaration. It is a slow rotation of perspective, felt in small decisions, rather than grand exits. Your voice is rebuilt in ordinary moments. The message you no longer rush to send. The apology you no longer offer out of fear. The explanation you stop giving to earn peace. The silence you no longer interpret as danger. The emotional climate you no longer let someone else regulate. This resonates because it mirrors what many adults lived quietly for years. The grief of lost time. The exhaustion of loops repeated. And the quiet relief of realizing the loop can be interrupted not by confrontation, but by choosing a different internal movement. Here is the truth that pulls people into long-form content. You don't heal by controlling the cycle. You heal by becoming unavailable to the parts that once controlled you. Your reaction matters more than the silence or the return, not as self-blame, but as empowerment. Your reaction is the variable the pattern cannot rewrite unless you hand it over. When your reactions shift, the cycle destabilizes. When the cycle destabilizes, your identity breathes. And when your identity breathes, peace returns gradually, not as fantasy. This is the emotional airlock moment, no longer pulled by the gravity of him, but by the gravity of your new self-permission to exist without fear-based responsiveness. And this leads directly to the next video in the series. If silence was phase 1, and the return was phase 2, then phase 3 is deeper. The phase where your mind begins detaching not from the person, but from the emotional choreography that once dictated your worth. That is the chapter your audience will want next, where retention becomes transformation. So the closing invitation is a doorway. What was one small moment when his return confused you? And what shifted inside you when the pattern began to lose its authority? This invitation triggers storytelling, builds community, and signals that the viewer isn't consuming content. They are participating in a slow, steady rewriting of their emotional narrative. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming consistent. And consistent identity is the one thing a manipulative dynamic cannot survive.